Cool. So my name is Eleftherios. I'm the co-founder of a project called Oscoin, and the title of my talk today is Towards a Sustainable Open Source Ecosystem. I'm going to split the talk in three sections. The first section is about open source software and the state of its financing. The second section is about cryptocurrencies and some relevant properties that I believe that they have for financing open source software. And on the last part of my talk, I'm going to talk about the work that we're doing on Radical and open source coin. Let's make it interactive. In each of these sections, I'm going to pause in the end of them, and then you can ask questions if you have, okay? Cool. So a lot of different speakers the last 2 days spoke about this. Software is eating the world. What I want to communicate is that it's actually open source software that is eating the world. Using some numbers from GitHub and a bunch of other places. If you look on our open source ecosystem, actually we have more projects on open source and more contributions than ever. The first graph is from GitHub. In addition, it seems that most developers these days at work, they use some form of open source software. This was a survey that opensourcesurvey.com did, and they found that most, like 94% of devs use open source software at work. And then finally, the part that not so many people talk about, that I'm excited about, is that for the first time ever, we have a big technology wave that is almost exclusively open source. And I'm talking specifically about Web3. This is a screenshot from CoinMarketCap back from January, so the values are a little bit lower these days. But yeah, you get the point. So if you're looking at our open source ecosystem from far, you might be tempted to say that we live in glory days for open source. And indeed, open source software has become public infrastructure of the internet, from Fortune 500 companies to hospitals to schools. Almost everyone depends on open source today. But unfortunately, if you look a little bit deeper, the image is not so nice. On open source, we have primarily three types of actors. Okay, we have users, companies, individuals, non-profits, etc. We have contributors, and we have maintainers. And if you look at the data, how these things have evolved over the years, you will see that usage of open source software has actually skyrocketed over the years. We have more users than ever. Contributions to open source software have also increased significantly. But the one number that actually hasn't grown over the years is the amount of maintainers. And for the least technical people in the room, maintainers are these people that, for example, if a developer has a contribution to an open source code base, the maintainers are the ones that actually have to go and review that and decide if they want to merge it to the code base. Usually these are the people that do all the ugly work. I call them the glue of the community. You know, they bring people together, they organize the community, they answer questions, and of course they merge code. And unfortunately, this number hasn't been growing over the years. And if you want to try to understand why this is happening, we ending up with incentives. And I'm not talking about economic incentives. Okay, actually, what's going on with maintainers is that most of these people don't start open source work for money. They start open source work because of intellectual curiosity. They have a problem themselves that they want to solve for themselves and for the world. They're looking for reputation many times. They're looking for community. But what actually happens is that the moment that they release a good code base on the web, and then that code base now starts to receive a lot of attention, now suddenly something that they developed late at night and on the weekends, now they have to go and maintain it on the weekends. And they have to maintain it with all of these people around them that make money by using their software. And now they have all of these questions. And now they have to go do that very, very ugly work. And this is exactly where the misalignment of incentives is happening, on that transition from, okay, like interesting intellectual pursuit, to now this thing is public infrastructure, and now I actually have to go and maintain this on my spare time. So that's the part that really puzzles me, and I think it really puzzles a lot of people on the internet. I believe that we have to do better there. And for the ones of you that like numbers, that just one statistic again from Nadia Agpal that used to lead open source at GitHub, 9.3 of NPM packages have only one maintainer, just one, right? So the bus factor is quite problematic. And by the way, this number doesn't change so much based on popularity. even very successful open source projects usually might have 2 or 3 maintainers. So there's something problematic there. Now, taking a step back and try to look at what kind of financing solutions we have, what kind of economic rewards we have around open source software, I use this simple framework. It doesn't try to be precise. Categorizing all of the different open source work, this is quite difficult. But there are like roughly 5 categories, 5 clusters. The one of it is programming languages. Pretty straightforward. Another one is frameworks, things like the Reacts and the Vues and all of these things. And then we have libraries, which is a big chunk of the web. It's on the millions, apparently, right now. And then we have things like databases, and then we have other stuff like infrastructure, thing of the Dockers, the Kubernetes, and all of these things. And now, if you look towards financing options and what works well and what doesn't work so well, you see that we have solutions for the latter two. Okay, and in there for infrastructure-related stuff, we have the open core model that works quite well. So you have an open core, and then around it you have certain features. We also have the dual licensing model that many successful open source projects like MySQL or MariaDB used down there. Then we have another model that now starts to get a little bit more traction, which is this idea of a paid support or paid issue tracker, if you want to think about. And then we have the whole software as a service. So there is something that works there. You can indeed develop open source software and be able to make a living. You can do it in a sustainable way. But the moment that you go a little bit further up the stack, you realize that there's not much. Okay, like open core doesn't work well for libraries or doesn't work well for programming languages. So there's a big question mark there, and I think that people that are thinking about the sustainability of open source need to be focusing their attention a lot there. In addition, I want to mention that there are 2 more things that are very interesting and important. I don't consider them significant because of the transactional nature. Sorry, I don't consider them sustainable because of the transactional nature that they have. And these 2 things are on the one side bounties, and there's a lot of good work actually right now happening even on the blockchain space. The guys from Gitcoin are in the back sitting there. You should speak to them. They're doing very well there, and they have a great mission. And then also there's the whole space of donations and crowdfunding, things like Patreon, things like Kickstarter, things like Open Collective. They start to get more attention, but they're still relatively small, especially the crowdfunding side. I think Open Collective does around $1.5 million a year towards open source. So what I want you to keep from this is that, indeed, if you're focusing on sustainability of open source, the real problem lies up there somewhere. We have no sustainable solution for that. I'm going to pause here. Questions for this first section? Anything unclear? Anything? Okay, then I'm gonna keep going. Okay, so for the second section of my talk, I want to focus on cryptocurrencies because I believe that they have some interesting properties that could be used to address the problem of sustainability of open source. So for most people that are involved with open source, the journey starts with Bitcoin. And Bitcoin was fascinating for many of us because it had this one interesting property. For the first time ever, we had an internet network that was actually distributing value and was rewarding value producers, I'm referring to the miners in this case, in a decentralized way, without a corporation in control. And what happened as verifiable computation, which is what proof of work was, we started seeing around, especially around 2016, we started seeing a lot of experiments that were trying to extend this idea of verifiable computation to include human work. And the thesis behind that was very straightforward, actually, that in a decentralized network, you don't only have machines, if you wish, but you also have humans that are doing some kind of work and contribute value to this decentralized network. You want to think of developers, the most obvious one, that provide protocol upgrades. You want to think of researchers that are doing research. You want to think of people that are doing marketing work, etc. So from 2016, roughly, we started seeing a bunch of implementations of this thesis. And we saw, for example, on Zcash, Zcash has this idea that they call, this concept that they call founder's reward. At every block, they mint a few new tokens, and instead of distributing them all towards miners, a small chunk of them goes to the Zcash Foundation, which is just a centralized body that further deploys that capital towards open source software. Decred right now is working on a very similar concept that they call Politia. What's different there is that they're using coin voting to actually distribute funds towards their community. We saw also we also saw the case of Steemit that extended this to blogging, and interesting experiment. It didn't work so well in many ways, I think. And then also we saw Dash, which was kind of the pioneer of this idea of a decentralized treasury. And what Dash did is very similar. So we're going to have like an inflationary schedule. You mint a few new tokens, and then you distribute a big chunk of them to miners, and then a small portion of them goes to a decentralized treasury. And then in there, the coin holders can decide how they want to deploy that capital. And then you have a system of proposals. While this, from a game theoretic standpoint, is quite of a nightmare, it's very problematic as you can have loads of attacks. I think what they started demonstrating is that we need to think carefully, and we need to think about how we can incentivize different actors within our network. And that was just one implementation of that. This spurred a lot of debate on the internet. Fred Ersam wrote this article that a lot of people, I assume, read, Funding the Evolutions of Blockchains. He coined the term of inflation funding as this idea that what if we use these newly minted tokens and direct them to different parts of the network. Vlad and Vitalik replied that obviously on-chain governance, coin voting on blockchains is very problematic, and indeed it is very problematic. But the pattern that I think that we're going to see more, I think the box is open. We're going to see a lot more experimentation there. And the pattern that I believe that we're going to start seeing more on the future is this idea that you have some sort of network, okay? Maybe that's a payment, maybe that's a payment network, maybe that's a store of value type of network, maybe that's a blogging network. And then you have a currency that's being used to transact within that network. And then in addition to that, you have some form of treasury that now somehow allocates some part of these funds and tries to incentivize different actors. And the key idea here is that I think developers started to understand that if you're issuing a currency, you're basically controlling its monetary policy, right? So, and if you're controlling its monetary policy, you can decide how and where you want to direct it. Now, what's funny and what's bringing the first section of my talk with the second section of my talk is that on the open source world, we have been talking about an open source tax for like the last 15 years. There were a lot of developers for the last 15 years, like idealists at the core that were thinking that, we need to tax Google and we need to tax Facebook. They're making all of this money on the back of open source software. The problem that all of these people had was that actually, they don't control the monetary policy of the currencies they use, right? Practically, you cannot do this. There's no possible way to do this. The accounting books of Google are over here, and then, what's going on with open source software is over here. But now what's fun is that with some of these cryptocurrencies, actually, we have the ability to control monetary policy, and we have the ability to engineer similar type of rewards like an open source tax. And I know that a lot of libertarians hate the word tax. I'm referring to this idea of using inflation to finance open source work. So that's the second part of my talk. Now I want to focus towards what we're doing with Radical and open source coin. Thinking of all of these things that I mentioned before, it was very logical for us to envision a different type of network, a network where developers join the network to collaborate around code, and that network has its own currency that you use to transact within that network, and also this network has its own decentralized treasury that is being used to reward open source projects within that network. We saw in this idea an alternative way to finance open source work, and we started a year and a half ago. We started actually working on this project. So what we really want to achieve and where our efforts go, we want to provide a peer-to-peer alternative to platforms like GitHub or GitLab that are not only architecturally decentralized, but are also economically decentralized. We really think that in these economies, it's open source developers that are actually contributing most of the work. So we really want to go and think hard and try to innovate on how we can actually incentivize them in these networks. So the first thing that we're doing and the first thing that we announced last week is this set of technologies that we call Radical. And Radical is a peer-to-peer stack for code collaboration. It has 3 components. At the core of it, there's a language for specifying, interpreting, and dynamically modifying the semantics of arbitrary state machines. How many of you know here Scuttlebutt? Okay, we have some on the section, only one person on the other section. Okay, so Scuttlebutt has this idea of replicated feeds. One analogy that might be helpful here with what we're doing with Radical is that we're taking this idea and we're extending that to any arbitrary state machine. Okay, and we released a paper for this last week, and also we released a code base. You can go play with that. I'll share the link later. So that's the first component. In addition, on top of that, there's a peer-to-peer layer. It's a gossip and state replication layer for publishing and subscribing to updates from other collaborators. This is again very much influenced with what's going on in the SSB world. And finally, in the last part the last part of the stack is something that we call Radical Garden. And the idea here is that we want to give developers tools out of the box for for issues, for commits, for all of these things that they do and they used to do when they collaborate around code. Now they should be able to do this from their CLI in a very nice peer-to-peer way. And I want to say a few words about the properties that inform these 3 things that I mentioned before. So what are we really trying to accomplish here? So when we started with Radical, we had a few things in mind. Okay, the first thing that we had in mind was to try to create a peer-to-peer network that is offline first. And I know that this sounds kind of counterintuitive, but you can think of Git as an offline first model. But what's funny here is that with existing code collaboration networks like GitHub, they started as a code hosting platform, like store your Git objects here, and that's cool. And obviously, like every other play on Web 2.0, they evolved into these massive things that now also you have all of the social artifacts around Git, right? And these are not interoperable the same way that your Git objects are interoperable. So when we're thinking about Radical, we wanted to basically give the ability to developers to control all their data, including their issues, comments. Any social artifact basically is yours and lives on your machine. That was the first consideration. The second thing that we wanted to do is actually we wanted to build something peer-to-peer, not blockchain in this case. And the rationale for that is that blockchains are actually kind of slow and expensive, and they are a great weapon for certain things, they're a horrible weapon for another thing. So what we realized along the way is that actually we want to build something for peer-to-peer, true peer-to-peer collaboration without an intermediary in control, not even like, you know, a DHT. And that's the second consideration that we had. In addition, you have other things that are very common on the blockchain world, like cryptographically secure, like all user data are tamper-proof and unforgeable. And then another interesting property that we wanted to satisfy is this idea of programmability. I showed you before this graph with users, contributors, and maintainers of open source. And our vision is very much into empowering maintainers, both economically, but not just that, but also with technology and tooling. So one of the things that we wanted to do with Radical is we wanted to give the ability to different communities to define the semantics of their interactions. What an issue means on the Scuttlebutt community potentially might be different on the Ethereum community. And I want to give you a concrete example so you understand why this is needed. For example, with GitHub, the most popular code bases have thousands of issues, right? And this is kind of great for contributors because anyone can go and open an issue and have fun and bug the maintainers. On the maintainer side, it's actually quite problematic because now you have to go and navigate thousands of issues and try to find what's meaningful and what isn't. So one of the things that maintainers are doing today is they try to basically like have guidelines on how to contribute, but there's no way for them to enforce these guidelines. Here with Radical, one of the things that you can do, for example, is you can say that, hey, an issue is only valid if you're providing a failing test. You can codify that. You don't need to actually go and request that. So that's the idea of programmability. Finally, the last thing that I want to mention is something that is interoperable and open, and as I mentioned, not just on the Git objects that are already interoperable between existing hosting providers, but also including the social artifacts. We released a paper last week on that topic that formally specifies the language. It's a Lisp-based dialect, looks a little bit like Clojure. So it's on our website, oscoin.io. Yeah, please go read that. And then I talked a bit about what we're doing on the peer-to-peer side. I also want to talk about what we're doing on the incentivization side. And yesterday on Juan Bennett talking about Web3 and trying to define Web3, he used this definition that Web3 is decentralized web plus blockchain, and also he had linked data on the one side, and I really like that. I think that's very much spot on, and it also very much goes against this idea of, like blockchain is everything. No, blockchain isn't everything. The decentralized web actually includes many more things, includes the P2P web, includes many ideas from the semantic web, etc. So indeed, Web3, I like this. I think decentralized web plus blockchain, it involves much more than just blockchain. So bringing that to what we do, what we want to accomplish is on the one side, Radical, which is free and peer-to-peer. You can use it to collaborate around code without requiring any token, if you wish. And then in addition, if you want to have economic transactions, we also want to give you the ability to be able to do that. And that's basically where our own blockchain is being introduced. And this is the idea of open source coin or Oscoin. So what we want to do with the ledger, and for the first year of the project, we focus much more on Radical and the peer-to-peer side. Now we're starting to focus much more also on the ledger. And what we want to accomplish there is we want to give developers the ability to attach economic value to any interaction within Radical. Okay, I spoke before about users, contributors, maintainers, all of this. So the way we're thinking about this is that we want to provide interfaces for developers to create any type of economic model around their piece of software. You want to you want to have something like bounties, you can do this. You want to have something like Patreon-like, you can do this. You want to do more advanced things like payout of dependencies, you can do that. So that's where our ledger is being introduced, and now we're starting to work towards that. And then finally, I want to say a few words about this idea of decentralized treasury, which is where we started. So we were thinking a lot about that, and we started with this idea that what if we build a network that has its own currency, where you can use the currency to transact on that network, and also has this payout scheme where some tokens, some of the newly minted tokens, are actually being directed back to the community, back to the open source projects that the community values. And in our journey for the last year, we've been doing a lot of research and we're prototyping things. We started looking towards different things. And we started with a simple curation market. What if we have a scheme where indeed you can vote with your coins and you can put them behind an open source project that you depend on? Unfortunately, all of these stake-based things suffer from, their game theoretic properties are not that strong. In a very intuitive way, you can have a scheme where I support your city project, you support my city project, and then suddenly now the inflation is being directed towards both of us. So that doesn't hold that well. So we've been trying to actually find solution to some of these on-chain governance problems that Vlad and Vitalik have outlined. And where we ended up, and what's the direction that we're exploring right now, we ended up going back to this idea of dependencies. And what's interesting here is that on open source code we have this beautiful thing that is dependencies, and dependencies are a little bit like the web, you know. So the same way that in order for you to provide a good experience on your website towards your users, you have to link to a bunch of different websites. It's very similar on the dependency side. In order for me to have, you know, like to provide a good experience on my library, sorry, I need to depend on a bunch of other libraries. And if I try to, you know, to add a bunch of fake libraries in there, I degrade the experience of my library somehow. So we started thinking about how we could use that to direct some of these new limited tokens. And what's fun is that there are already a bunch of people that have been doing work on that front. There's this project that's called Libraries.io that I highly recommend that you should check out. So these are two guys that basically have been scraping package managers in order to identify which are the most dependent projects and try to find issues down there with licenses, with bugs, with bus factors, etc. It's a fascinating piece of work. You should definitely take a look at that. But where we end up with this whole idea is that actually, you know, for websites and for the web, Google actually used something like PageRank to try to figure out how to rank content. So the idea and the direction that we're currently exploring is actually to use something similar that we call SourceRank to try to calculate this one global, to try to create this one global dependency graph and direct some of the new limited tokens based on this idea. And what we really like on that is that actually it fits really well this graph. It fits really well this gap. It works very well for libraries. It doesn't work so well for applications, as you can imagine, but it works very well where the problem is at its worst. So that's all from me for now. So what's coming on our roadmap? Last week we released Radical. You can find it under oscoin.io/radical. And we plan to release more components on Radical by the end of the year. And we're also outlining some of this work on SourceRank and all the incentivization things that we do. We want to get our paper out by the end of this year, and we hope that we can be on a testnet around March. Thank you. Do I have time for questions or no? One, just one. Okay. Yes, please.
You said that getting funds is problematic for open source projects. So my question is, do you also do open source, and how do you get funds? I think you have the same problem, right?
Correct. So there are different ways. So the same way that most open source projects work, that you're gonna have someone that will be like, hey, I want to donate on you, or like, I want to invest in you, etc. So that's how you bootstrap the project. So that's how we bootstrap the project. We found a bunch of individuals that actually buy the mission and want to contribute to that. And the whole idea is that actually we bring this network live. This network will have its own currency, and then from there, demand, supply, and the rest.